Shabbat Shalom. It's nice to be able to all be together, even just virtually, on this Shabbat. I'm Rabbi Daniel Reeser, and I'm joined in the leadership of this service by a handful of co-service leaders, by Rabbi Jonathan Blake, by Cantor Amanda Kleinman, by some wonderful congregants of Westchester Reform Temple, who I'll introduce further in a moment, also by Oren Nyman, who will help accompany us with music, and by Dr. Sam Kassow, who will be speaking for us in just a few moments in our service. This Shabbat is not an ordinary Shabbat for Westchester Reform Temple, or indeed for the Jewish people. This is the first Shabbat immediately after the Jewish day known as Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, which is Hebrew that translates to mean the day of remembering the Holocaust and for celebrating the heroes who helped to make that terrible time in Jewish history and in world history just a little bit more bearable through small acts of heroism. Yom HaShoah is a solemn day on the Jewish calendar, and we marked it Monday evening into Tuesday. And this evening, Westchester Reform Temple comes together for a community-wide tradition known as our Service of Responsibility. The Service of Responsibility is a long-standing WRT tradition where we honor the memory of the Holocaust through a number of long-standing congregational traditions. And even though we're only able to gather virtually this year, nevertheless, all of those long-standing traditions, or many of those long-standing traditions, will still be a part of our Service of Responsibility this evening. We're being joined through our various streaming platforms by many members of our current sixth grade class, who in the coming weeks will be paired with one of the 1.5 million Jewish children who died in the Holocaust, so that these students of ours, on the day that they become bar or bat mitzvah, can hold up the memory of one of those children and help to keep their legacy alive. And it thereby helps our students make better sense of the massive number of 6 million people by boiling it down just to one individual life, one person whose life was ended and who didn't get to achieve the milestone of bar or bat mitzvah. So we welcome all of our sixth graders who are joining us this evening, and we look forward to your helping to hold up the memory of the Holocaust on the day of your bar or bat mitzvah. Another of our longstanding Service of Responsibility traditions is that we will hear a story of survival. This evening, we'll, in a few moments, hear from Dr. Sam Kassow, who will tell us his family's story of survival. That's coming a little later on this evening. And an annual piece of this service is, of course, the lighting of 6 memorial candles in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. And again, although we're only able to gather virtually, we have 6 congregants, 6 families who belong to Westchester Reform Temple who have a personal family connection to the Holocaust, who are going to help us observe the memory of the Holocaust by lighting candles. Those people whose faces you'll see in just a moment are Jody Brody, Karen Freed, Lisa Tretler, David Sokol, Debbie Schuster Bonagario, and Karen Bach. And as we light these candles, we'll also hear music from our guitarist Oren Nyman, and I'll let Cantor Kleinman say a few more words about the music we'll be hearing.
Throughout our service this evening, you'll hear some beautiful music with connection to the Shoah, with connection to the Holocaust. The piece of music that you heard at the beginning of our service was a beautiful arrangement of Hannah Senish's famous poem, Eli, Eli, that was arranged by our very own Pete Malinverni. And we're so pleased to have Oren Nyman with us this evening on guitar, as well as we light our memorial candles. Oren is going to be playing a piece of music called Unter deine weiße Stern, which means under your white stars. This is a piece of music written by Avraham Sutzkever, who was a famous Yiddish poet, perhaps best known for the music that he composed during the Holocaust. And this is a poem that he wrote while he was living in the Vilna ghetto, which Oren will share with us now as we kindle our memorial candles.
on the live broadcast.
Got it.
Not fun.
And it's behind.
Thank you to all of our candle lighters. We move now from the candle of memorial to the candle of Shabbat and light these candles to help welcome in this day of rest. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner Shel Shabbat.
We continue welcoming Shabbat with the words of Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharei, Malachei Elyon, Melech Malchei HaMelachim,
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It really is very sweet to join you and to know that we are broadcasting into more than 200 homes tonight as of the last count, and to feel the closeness even when we can't be in each other's arms is still so meaningful, particularly now on what is freighted time on the Jewish calendar, one that carries with it the heaviness of remembrance of the Shoah, and that leads us to more remembrance next week when we will acknowledge the fallen of Israel's soldiers, leading up to the joy of later next week when we celebrate Israel's independence. These 10 days are consequential indeed. Let us remember. Week after week in distress and under unsettled conditions, the Sabbath made a noble way possible for this people, one that was divorced from everything common. Rest was to reign on this day, to last and smallest instant, from evening to evening, in order to banish all that draws downward, to provide the soul with a broad and lofty space. Without the Sabbath, this people would dispossess itself. Where the Sabbath is understood, so is this people understood. Rabbi Leo Beck, great Reform rabbi who refused to leave behind his flock, even though it meant that he would be interred along with them in the Nazi camp Theresienstadt. Let us rise if we are so moved and able, as we are called to prayer and offer Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, Leolam Va'ed. You may be seated. The last will and testament of Yussel Rockover. I, Yussel Rockover, descendant of great and pious families, write the lines while the Warsaw Ghetto goes up in flames. As the firing around me becomes weaker and the last defenders of this outpost fall, I die peacefully but not complacently, persecuted but not enslaved, a believer, not a supplicant. And these are my last words to you, my wrathful God. Nothing will avail you. You have done everything to make me renounce you, to make me lose my faith, but I die exactly as I have lived, a believer. Eternally praised be the God of the dead, the God of truth and law, who will soon show your face to the world again and shake its foundations with your almighty voice. And so let us together proclaim the words that so many of our people offered last before being led to their end. We sing Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto, Leolam Va'ed. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol meodecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam B'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha b'aderech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha u'kshartam leot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot beineinecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uv'isharecha leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai Vitem kidoshim leloechem, Ani Adonai Eloechem, Asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, Lihio lachem lelohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem. There's always a bit of cognitive dissonance when we sing a song of freedom on a Shabbat that acknowledges the incarceration and murder of so many of our people, as well as millions of other human beings whom the Nazis targeted for devastation. But for us Jewish people, the march to freedom is not one that was accomplished long ago when we left Egypt. Rather, it is something we enact and reenact in every generation. And it's important to remind ourselves that even now, as we're quarantined at home, we should still taste a little bit of the freedom to worship each in our own place, each in our own way. Rights that we know are precious for Jewish people because too often in our history they were deprived by others who sought to destroy us. So when we sing Micha Mocha tonight, we'll do it with an extra sense of courage and commitment, and I'll invite you to join with me. Micha Mocha Ba'elim Adonai Nedar ba'kodesh Nora tehilot Oseh Felen Nora tehilot Oseh Felen Elim Adonai Ikamocha Netar ba'kodesh.
Let there be love and understanding among us. Let declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Velohei Avoteinu ve'imoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Velohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Velohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor ve'hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, Ve'konei Hakol, Ve'zocher Chasdei Avot ve'imahot, U'mevii Geula livnei v'neihem, Leman Shemo be'ahava, Melech Ozer u'Moshia u'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah, Atah Gibor le'olam Adonai, Mechayeh hakol atah Rav le'oshia, Morid hatal, Mechalkel chaim bechesed, Mechayeh hakol berachamim rabim, Somech noflim ve'rofeh cholim, Umatir asurim, Umekayem emunato lishenei afar. Michamocha bal gevurot umido melach. Melech memit umechayeh umatzmiach Yeshua. V'ne'eman ata lahachayot hakol. Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hakol. Atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, u'kdoshim bechol yom yahalelucha selah. Baruch atah Adonai ha'el hakadosh. We'll take a few moments now for silent reflection. As you pray silently, you will hear a meditation called Keshet Tigdal. It's a song by a famous Israeli rock star named Yehuda Palaker. Both of his parents were Holocaust survivors, and Palaker created an album that was inspired by their stories of survival. This song in particular commemorates his father's story. His father lost his wife as well as a child during the Holocaust, and this song, Keshet Tigdal, is about a parent who is expressing his dreams and his hopes for his child. we take a moment now to pray for all of those who are in need of healing. And so if there's anyone you're thinking of who would benefit from knowing that a caring and supportive community such as ours is keeping them in our hearts, I would ask you to recite their name aloud or to keep their names in your hearts as together we recite the words of the Mishaberach. This evening, our congregation is thinking of Leah Greenspan, Rivka Batsura, Amelia Austin, Aviva Tsiela Bat Esther Bela, Dan Sokoloff, Jeffrey Millman, Judy Leal, Chava Batsara, Eliyahu Chaim Ben Fredel, Sheila Freed, Tanya Romanoff, Yitzchak Yona Ben May, Malka Tzipora Bas Rachel, Yaakov Hirsch Ben Rachel, Tamar Bat Malka, Avraham Ben Miriam, David Tremsky, Heschel Meir Ben Davida Chana. And we sing together now the words of the Mishaberach. Mishaberach Avotenu Mekor HaBracha Leimotenu. May the source of strength who bless the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mishaberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
In just a moment, we're going to hear from our guest, Dr. Samuel Kassow, who will share with us a part of his family's story of survival in the Holocaust. Dr. Kassow has been a scholar in residence here at WRT throughout the past year, has been with our community several times throughout the year to tell a little bit about his research interests. And believe me, he's a really engaging scholar with really interesting interests. And that's not what we're going to be hearing about tonight. Tonight's not about the scholarly, but about the personal. And I'll say a word more or two to introduce Dr. Kassow in just a moment. But before we introduce him and hear his family's story, a word about hearing stories like this, stories of survival. There's a lot of conversation in the Jewish educational sphere about why it's so important that we hear stories like the one that we're about to hear. There's many different reasons one could give for why these stories matter. And I want to name what some of those are and highlight one of them that I think is actually most important. There's one reason why one reason that's not the reason why we tell these stories is not in order to shock or to horrify, though indeed these stories are often quite shocking and certainly full of horrible, horrible things that happened. We don't tell them in order to shock and horrify. Another reason that we might tell these stories is in order to educate. And I would argue that that too is not the primary reason why we tell stories of survival, though these stories have much to teach us about the depths of human cruelty. Education is not the main reason why we tell stories like the one we're about to hear. I think the real reason why it's so important that all of us hear stories like the one that Dr. Kassow is about to share is definitely not to shock or to horrify, and even not to educate, but rather simply to bear witness. in order to remember the terrible things that have happened, and in order, in some small way, to make those who suffered less alone in their suffering, even though we and they are separated by decades and by continents. By hearing their story, somehow we remove just the tiniest sliver of the aloneness that they might have felt. We bear witness. We allow them to live on in memory by hearing the things that happened to them. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Samuel Kassow. Dr. Kassow is the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. His academic work focuses on the history of Ashkenazi Jewry. He has served as a consultant to the Polin Museum of History of the Polish Jews in Warsaw. He's the author of many books and articles, including most famously his book, Who Will Write Our History? Rediscovering a Hidden Archive from the Warsaw Ghetto, which was turned into an award-winning film in 2008. Dr. Kassow's parents are survivors of the Holocaust, and Dr. Kassow was himself born in a displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, Germany. Please welcome now Dr. Samuel Kassow.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your remarks. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for your remarks, and Shabbat Shalom. I've given many talks over the years, but this is the first time I'm giving this kind of a talk, and it's not easy to do. As I was growing up on Yom HaShoah, a survivor would come up and tell what happened to them, and we would listen. But now that the survivors are mostly gone, I understand that it's up to us, to children of survivors, to try to put together their story and talk about what they went through. What happened during the war was not very much talked about in our homes. It was very difficult to put the pieces together. It was like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. It came out here and there, and we were always finding out new things. Like my first cousin, David, was in college when he found out that his father had had a wife and child before the war. This was something new that he'd never heard of before. Okay, and now for our family story. Both my mother and father came from one of the poorest parts of pre-war Poland, a rural area east of Vilna, which is now in Belarus. When you hear about the Holocaust, you often hear about the trains, about the death camps, about the bureaucrats sitting behind desks, signing papers, giving orders. But in our part of Europe, nobody was put on trains. Nobody was sent to death camps. There were dozens of little rural ghettos. And eventually, alongside each of these little ghettos, the Germans dug deep pits and they shot Jews in rows of 10. And here the killing was up close and personal. And your neighbors, the people you'd known all your life, would happily betray you for a pound of sugar or a bottle of vodka. And they might even join in, have some fun, and kill you themselves. Although in some cases, they also showed sublime courage and risked their lives to help us. Now for my father's family. My father's dad had lived in New Haven, Connecticut as a young man, but instead of bringing the rest of the family over, he got homesick and returned to Poland. And he died before the war. My father grew up in a little town called Dolhinov. He had a mother, 2 sisters, and a brother. And my father had an incredible stroke of luck. In 1940, he was arrested by the Soviets, and they'd occupied Eastern Poland. And my father was one of the hundreds of thousands of people who were sent to the Gulag. And the mortality rate in his Soviet camp was only 50%. And my mother, therefore, always believed that my father had spent the war years in a country club. And they'd only met when the war was over. During the first massacre in the Dolhinov ghetto, about 1,000 Jews were herded into a big barn and burned alive. And that's how my grandmother, my father's mother, Liba, was killed. Sora, a sister, was shot in the second massacre with her husband and 2 children. But amazingly, another sister, Minna, and her brother Avremel survived. That other sister, Minna, worked in a pharmacy in the nearby town of Glubok. In June 1942, she was one of the 2,500 Jews selected to be marched 2 miles away to the Barak forest to be shot. What happened next defies belief. And the story was that she took her turn, lined up, the machine guns went off. She fainted from fright and fell into the ditch. She came to covered with dead bodies. And here's where it gets unbelievable. She raised her hand and she saw the Germans and their Lithuanian helpers at tables, drinking schnapps, eating sandwiches. And she raised her hand and asked them to shoot her because she didn't want to be buried alive. But at this point, the Germans were so drunk that it kind of turned into a kind of a fraternity party. And one of them suggested, hey guys, let's send her back into the ghetto to warn the other Jews what's going to happen to them. And that's what they did. She went back into the Glubok ghetto, the only survivor of that massacre. And then she went through the second final massacre in August 1943. She was in a hideout with other Jews. A German threw a grenade into the hideout. Again, she was the only survivor. After the war, after a year and a half in the forests, she emerged. She married, settled in Philadelphia, and had a son and a daughter. But to put it mildly, she was not what you would call a normal, happily adjusted person. My father's brother, Avremel, also survived. He was in Vileka, the same area, and he had a wife and 2 children. They were outside the Vileka ghetto with other Jews in a mill by a river. The Germans allowed them to be there to prepare wheat. And in June 1942, no warning whatsoever, they saw cars coming up the road at a high speed, full of Germans and Lithuanian police. There was no time to think. There was a panic. Everybody started to run. They started shooting. And it turned out that only my uncle Avremel and one other person survived. His wife and 2 children were dead in the field. And after the war, he never got his life together. He never remarried. When he arrived in New Haven in 1949, he followed us. He shared a bedroom with me. I was a small child, and at night, night after night, he'd sit propped up in bed, smoking a cigarette, and lament that in that terrible moment, he had not thought to grab his children and save them. And instead, he ran in a panic to save himself. And he would say over and over again, why am I alive? Why am I alive? He died alone in Philadelphia in 1974. My mother came from a town in the same region, Sharkeshene. It had 1,000 Jews. The Jews were about 90% of the population. She came from a family of 6 sisters, 2 brothers, and amazingly, 2 sisters and 2 brothers survived. Her father, my grandfather, lived as a young man in New York City. And he was known in the shtetl as Sam the American because he'd lived in the US, but he didn't like the United States. He didn't like the materialism. He didn't like the fact that Jews worked on Shabbos. He returned to Poland, started a successful flax business, and married a tall, beautiful woman, Liba, my grandmother. They had 8 kids. And Shmuel and the boys worked in the business while my grandmother and the girls helped run a big restaurant in the market square. And that's where my mother learned to become a fantastic cook. Saturday evenings in the winter, they would show movies. And the Jews and the Gentile would all come to the restaurant, the chairs put against the walls, and everybody would watch the the movies that they would show, including American movies. And my mother recalled that in the summer of 1939, they were told that in the following year, they would get Avec mit dem Wind, Gone with the Wind, and Der Kischichmacher von Oz, The Wizard of Oz. My mother was 17 years old when the Germans arrived in 1941. The Germans came, they told the town rabbi to choose 12 of the most respected Jews to form a Judenrat, a Jewish council. My grandfather was included. The horror began right away. For example, they pushed many Jews into a synagogue and they set the synagogue on fire. They humiliated you in countless ways. For example, you had to wear a big yellow star in front and back. You were not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. You had to take your hat off when you saw a German. Now, each of those things you might think were humiliations that one could live with. But imagine that you're walking with your yellow star in the street, and all of a sudden Germans in a Jeep start driving right at you. So you, of course, jump onto the sidewalk, and that gives them the excuse to get out of the Jeep and beat you up because you are on the sidewalk and because you didn't take your hat off. And those kinds of petty humiliations occurred all the time. The ghetto was extremely crowded, and it became more crowded because they dumped in 500 refugees from surrounding villages. As I said, my mother was 17 years old. She had to clean the floors in the commandant's office. And one day, the police commander, a Belarusian, got drunk and made an advance on my mother. She slapped him in the face. So he had the other police keep her in the basement all night, hitting her with a rubber truncheon. And the next morning, in front of the whole ghetto, he put a pistol to her head and told everybody that he was going to kill her. Now, imagine that her family's watching this, but it was a joke. He fired into the air. She fainted from fright and her hearing never recovered. Fast forward to June 17th, 1942. That week, many ghettos in the area were being liquidated, supervised by a gentleman named Hans Tangermann, who was sentenced to a couple years in prison in Berlin in the mid-50s, and I think only served a year. My mother heard the news in the commandant's office and told the Judenrat. The Judenrat in turn told everybody to get ready to run when they gave the signal. In a few hours, they saw rows of Germans and police assembling outside the ghetto, and the Judenrat gave everybody the signal to start running through the ghetto fence. Meanwhile, the members of the Judenrat, including my grandfather, set fire to every house, and they were all killed in the attempt. Now, people tried to run through the fence, but the problem was there was only one direction to go. The ghetto was bordered by a river in the back, so you could only go in one direction. And imagine trying to run, but seeing cordons and cordons of Germans with guns right in front of you. It meant that you had to run point blank right into them. And most people, when they saw that, became scared and didn't run at all. But many people decided they had no choice but to run through the cordon. There was total chaos, shooting, panic, confusion, yells, screams. On the spur of the moment, my mother grabbed her sister Slava, who was 11 years old, and she started running. A German put a gun right into her stomach and pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. She kept running, not letting go of her sister's hand. They made it into a swamp, and then they went to a peasant's house whom they knew to try to get food and water. As they approached, another sister, Chaya, who was 15, came running out of the house, signaling frantically with her hands not to approach. At that moment, she was shot in the back. There were police in the house, and Chaya had been trying to warn them not to come. They were back in the swamps. They were like hunted animals. The peasants were all hunting Jews because they were promised vodka, salt, and money. But a few days later, the Germans promised an amnesty. They gave the Jews 10 days to voluntarily leave the forests and swamps where they were hiding and go into the Glabok ghetto, the same ghetto where my father's sister had been. Virtually every surviving Jew, including my mother and sister, voluntarily went into that ghetto, knowing what would happen. What choice did they have? There was a professor after the war, Hannah Arendt, who said that the Judenretter should have told all the Jews to run, and more Jews would have survived. Well, in this town, the Judenretter did exactly that, but it really made no difference, because in the woods, you really had no chance to survive. Only a very few Jews refused to go into that second ghetto. That included my mother's two brothers, who became fighters in the Soviet partisans and eventually wound up in Israel. When my mother and sister entered the Glabokka ghetto, shattered, depressed, and disoriented, they discovered, to their great surprise, that their mother, my grandmother Liba, two other sisters, and their two children, 5-year-old Raful and 1-year-old Leah, were also there. Somehow they too had broken through the cordon and had survived in the swamps. Now, as I said, it was a terrible moment. No home, they were displaced, they were dazed, and then who should appear but a Polish boy named Piotr, a Polish high school classmate of my mom's. He had had a crush on her senior year, but of course, my religious grandparents put their foot down and said, no way. Now, Piotr arrives and he's asking everybody, is Celia Zimmer there? Where's Celia Zimmer? He wants to take her out of the ghetto and take her to his farm. He finds her with her mother, the sisters, all in a house, and my mother doesn't want to leave her mother. At this point, my grandmother, who had been a very religious woman, once a German gave my mother some meat to take home. He was a nice German, apparently, and my grandmother slapped my mother across the face, said, how could you bring treif meat into the house? My religious grandmother at this point pushed her daughter into this Pole's arms and said, I don't want to see you again. Go with this guy. And that was the last moment that my mother saw her mom. Piotr put her under bags of onions and took her to his farm. A few weeks later, my grandmother and her daughters left Glabok for the Pustov ghetto. Pustov was where my grandmother had originally come, and there were a lot of relatives. Suddenly, without warning, in November 1942, the Germans suddenly surrounded the Pustov ghetto. They herded everybody towards a big ditch in front of a half-frozen lake. It was November. As they marched to the ditch, I think this is true, that my aunt Mirke sedated her infant daughter Leah, who was by this time 1.5 years old, sedated her, left her by the side of the road with a note asking anyone to find this infant to take her. So Leah might still be alive today, who knows? So they were shot. Dina and 5-year-old Raful, Mirke, and when it was the turn of Slava and my grandmother was hit by bullets and was dying, and Slava was lying on top of her. Slava, the little girl, had been grazed by 2 bullets, one in the head and one in the leg, but she was alive. And as my grandmother's life ebbed away, she was still talking to her daughter Slava. She told Slava to play dead and then try to escape to Piotr's farm where my mother was hiding. And Slava turned around. Once again, it was the same story. The table, the schnapps, the sandwiches, the jokes, the laughing. And when the Germans were preoccupied, Slava went into the half-frozen lake, swam it, and then crawled 15 miles to the farm. I kid you not. In 1996, my sisters and I and Slava and her kids covered that area in a car, and it took us half a day. Slava crawled and crawled and crawled, and with her last strength, she made it to that farm. She was badly infected. Pyotr got her a doctor, and then he put my mother and Slava, the two sisters, together in a hideout underneath the barn. Some weeks later, an SS detachment arrived to fight partisans, and they set up shop in the barn. And my mother and Slava had to hide under the floorboards for 5 days in a deep pit. And they were covered with rats, but they couldn't do anything. By this time, they had acquired a pistol. My mother's brother, who was in the partisans, had given them a pistol. And they had decided that if the Germans caught them, they would kill themselves. But fortunately, the Germans did not catch them. A couple months later, they were denounced. And just before the Germans came to burn the farm, they ran into the forest with Pyotr. I'm now going to skip over an amazing year-long story of fighting in the Soviet partisans. But in June 1944, the Red Army pushed the Germans out of the area. And my mother and Slava were liberated along with other Jews. Pyotr was taken into the Red Army, and the surviving Jews in the area were given a chance to go to Poland, which they did, including my mother. And that's where she met my father. And I was born in Germany in 1946. Now, keep in mind, as I tell you this, I did not know this story for many, many, many years, not until I was in my 40s. It was all very, very vague. In the 1970s, I spent 2 years in the USSR writing my dissertation. I could not go to the shtetls of my mother and father because it was not allowed. And I didn't really know what was going on. And then in 1988, I was in Israel at my aunt and uncle's house, and they were having survivors over on a Saturday night. And one guy had too much to drink. And he said, "Sam, there's a guy named Pyotr Bilevich, and you should really thank him." And everybody looked at this man. They were very angry that he had mentioned the name. I asked my aunt and uncle, "Who is this man?" They said, "We don't want to talk about it." I asked my mother when I got back, "Who is this man?" She didn't want to talk about it. So my curiosity was piqued, but I couldn't find out anything else. Then in 1992, I was in Moscow, and I suddenly realized that there was no more Soviet Union, that I could go back. And on the spur of the moment, I got a taxi driver to take me 400 miles to Belarus. And without knowing any of the backstory, I went to this little town and just started asking people, "Where is Pyotr Bilevich?" Nobody knew. Finally, someone said he lives 10 miles away on a collective farm called Lenin's Road. We went to this farm, into this little village. I asked where he lived. Somebody pointed me to his house. I walk into a house, and I see a man, and I see his daughter and one grandchild. And I ask, "You, are you Pyotr Bilevich?" And he says, "Yes, who am I?" "I'm Celia's son." Total silence. You could hear a pin drop. Now, keep in mind that I did not know who he really was and what his relationship was to my mother. The first thing he asked me is, "What day were you born?" When I tell him, he realizes that I couldn't be his son, and he stops talking to me. And then his daughter, who turned out to be a high school teacher, took me for a long walk in the fields and told me that her father and my mother had been married during the war. They were together in the partisans. When Pyotr had been taken into the army, he expected that my mother would wait for him when he got back, but my mother left. And he came back feeling betrayed and very angry. And I myself was quite shaken. I went home. My mother was already quite sick, but I said, "Ma, you'll never guess who I ran into in Belarus." And when I told her it was Pyotr, she too was quite shaken. Then I said, "Ma, is it true? What happened?" And she said, "I did what I had to do to save my sister." And talking to her sister and talking to her, I realized that my mother felt terrible guilt. She went through agony because on the one hand, I do believe she loved this man, but on the other hand, as a Jewish woman, she didn't want to live in a place that was soaked in Jewish blood. So she made that difficult decision to leave. The daughter, Pyotr's daughter, said that her father went through many years of depression, feeling betrayed, but eventually married and had 2 children. The next year, I returned to Moscow to teach for the Jewish Theological Seminary, Project Judaica, the first Jewish studies courses in post-Soviet Russia. My mother urged me to go back. She gave me quite a lot of cash to take to them. And then my mother passed away. 2 years later, we all went back, me, my sisters, and that little girl that he saved, Slava, who is now living in Chicago. And we went back, and when Slava and Pyotr were reunited, it was an amazing scene because there was no baggage. They fell into each other's arms. He said to her in Polish, "Szczeniak, you little runt, you little squirt." And we stayed in this village for a week. We dedicated a memorial to the murdered Jews. And then we set the ball rolling to get him recognized as a righteous Gentile in Yad Vashem. In 1998, he and his daughter came to Jerusalem, and there was a wonderful ceremony which was carried on Israeli television. Pyotr died in 2008, and Slava's testimony is on YouTube. She gave a testimony for Spielberg. If you want to hear it yourselves, look up Slava Fintel, Fintel. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying that to the outside world, the story of the survivors is seen as a success story. They survived, they started new homes, new families. Their children, for the most part, were high achievers. We, of course, know the other side, that they all paid a very, very heavy price. And that's the side that was talked about much less. And I think of one thing that Slava told me. She said that as my grandmother was dying, her last words were, "I want one member of our family to survive, at least one, so they could tell the story." And this was literally my grandmother's dying wish. And I'm glad that I've been able to do one small thing to make that come true. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kassow. Thank you, Oren. After hearing a story like that, it's hard to know what to say or to do. Thankfully, our tradition provides us with words to say in times when we might otherwise feel speechless. We'll begin to make a conclusion to our service by offering the words Aleinu l'shabeach, our concluding prayer, which reminds us Aleinu, it's on us to help make the world that we all so deeply want and need. Aleinu l'shabeach, it's on us. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol, la'tet gedula le'otzer bereshit, shelo asanu kigoye ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'goralenu kechol hamonam, ba'anachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim, Lifnei melech malchei hamelachim, hakadosh baruch hu. V'nemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. We have lived in numberless towns and villages. In too many of them, we have endured cruel suffering. Some we have forgotten. Others are sealed into our memory, a wound that does not heal. 100 generations of victims and martyrs, and still their blood cries out from the earth. And so many at Dachau, at Buchenwald, at Auschwitz, at Bergen-Belsen, at Baba Yar, and what can we say? What can we do? How bear the unbearable or accept what life has brought to our people? All who are born must die. But how shall we compare the slow passage of our time with the callous slaughter of the innocent, cut off before their time? They lived with faith, not all, but many, and surely many died with faith. Faith in God, in life, in the goodness that even flames cannot destroy. May we find a way to the strength of that faith, that trust, that sure sense that life and soul endure beyond this body's death. They have left their lives to us. Let a million prayers rise whenever Jews worship. Let a million candles glow against the darkness of these unfinished lives. And of course, this Shabbat, we're not only remembering the 6 million Jews and 5 million others of God's creatures who perished in the Holocaust, not just the scars and losses of our people, but even the personal scars and losses that members of our community are carrying with them this Shabbat. This week, WRT is remembering many members and many loved ones of members. Let us first read the names of these most recently departed in the last 4 weeks. We remember Joan Mark, mother of John Geverts, Donald Sheroff, husband of Marilyn Sheroff and father of Leslie Dubner and Gary Sheroff, Howard J. Dugoff, father of Julie Waxman, Stephen Cohen, uncle of Robert Mitchell, William Mantell, uncle of Jordan Barrow, Daniel Kestenbaum, father of Robert Kestenbaum, Paul Corrins, uncle of Janet Corrins and cousin of Bruce Steinberg, Dorothy Sarrett, mother of Linda Sarrett, Ken Safian, husband of Naomi Gross, Erica Cohen, aunt of Kate Levy, Ann Bernstein, mother of Diane Loft, Joel Willis, uncle of Wendy Burke, Robert Bader, father of Lynn Paulette, Yvonne Marks, mother of Aaron Marks, Henry Graff, father of Iris Morse and grandfather of Betsy Rothbart, Gary Greenfield, uncle of Andrew Levine, Jane Nussbaum, wife of Lawrence Nussbaum, mother of Barbara Nussbaum, Lynn Scott, and Larry Nussbaum. Anita File, mother of Allison File Green. Gerald Rubin, father of Neil Rubin and Stuart Rubin. Carl Weber, father of Corey Weber. Daniel Loft, father of Lloyd Loft and grandfather of Adam Green. Ira Cohen, uncle of Kate Levy. Marilyn Weingartner, loved one of Ann Cohen. And on the anniversary of their deaths, we remember Joan Albin, Ann Auspitz, Barbara Belzy, Joseph Bender, Samson Broadwin, Nancy Damashek, Ben Edelman, Erwin Ellman, Martin Fife, Sylvia Fishman, Mary Kaplan Geller, Harry Ginsberg, Nathan Glickman, Oscar Glickman, Herman Golden, Robert Hahn, Jesse Hennig, Jacob Hyatt, David Z. Johnson, Dora Jordan, Saul Bud Capel, Sarah Kaufman, Philip Kestenbaum, Martha Launer, Harry Levin, Rosalie Siegel, Harry Weinstein, Lily Lieberman, Joan Messenger, Marvin Meth, Ethel Michelson, Murray Nelson, Marcia Peleus, Nancy B. Raisin, Norman Rain, Retta Roseman, Ludwig Rodzitsky, Shepard Shapiro, Jack Young, James E. Siegel, Kenneth Sipser, Rose Smith, Isaac Weissman, Morris Weitz, Stella Zalaznik, as well as the 6 million Jews and 5 million of God's other creatures who perished in the Holocaust. If there are any names that have not yet been said aloud or any that I've inadvertently mispronounced, I invite you to say your loved one's name now privately where you are. The words of the Mourner's Kaddish can be found on the screen before you. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah, B'yalma divrach Hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala ubizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah mivarach le'olam u'lamei almaya. Yit barach v'yish tabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit ramam v'yit naseh. V'yit hadar v'yit ale v'yit halal Shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Ta'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imeru. Amen. As we conclude, we'd like to once again offer words of thanks to Dr. Samuel Kassow for sharing with us his family's story, also to Oren Nyman for gracing the service with beautiful music, and to our 6 WRT families who helped to kindle memorial lights. Thank you for helping to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive in our community by bringing your family's legacy to bear on how our community observes Yom HaShoah.
Shabbat Shalom.